Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started a little slowly here because we still have some people joining. But I'm going to launch just a quick poll to find out a little bit more about those of you who are here in attendance today. And I'll begin with introductions. So I am Dr. Keith McCall. I'm the Assistant Director of the Office of Graduate Fellowships and Awards here at FSU. Some of you may know me, some of you may know my office. You may have attended our workshops previously, or you may not have. Either way, welcome and thank you for being here. If you do not know who we are, our role on campus, we are part of the graduate school. Our job is to help graduate students at FSU identify and then apply for external funding opportunities. So primarily grants and fellowships that are coming from outside of FSU. So the things that require often lengthy and involved application processes, we can help you one-on-one through those processes, providing feedback on your materials. But we also every semester offer a slate of workshops on topics and skills related to preparing funding applications. I am recording this, and I will make sure that you all are aware when the recording is available. So just know that it will be on the Graduate School's YouTube probably in a couple weeks. I'm a little behind on getting things edited and posted because typically we are an office of 2. Right now we are an office of 1 as our usual full-time director, Dr. Adrian Stevenson, is with the National Science Foundation for a year. So I will admit things move a little bit more slowly when it's just me than they do otherwise. But I welcome you all to be with us today for a discussion on fellowship and grant writing in the humanities and social sciences. I have a background, my PhD is in history, so this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and one that I felt as a graduate student I did not receive much guidance in and was sort of left to figure these things out on my own, and I am now much better at them than I was as a graduate student. So I want to make sure that other graduate students in the humanities and social sciences get some of the knowledge that I felt like I did not get along the way of my graduate education. I'm thrilled to be joined today by 3 our panelists, our guest presenters, however we want to refer to them. Dr. Andy Chang from the Department of Sociology here at FSU is a sociologist focusing on international migration, gender, work and labor and development, and uses methods including ethnography, social theory, and qualitative approaches. Dr. Chang's book project, The Making of Global Care, explores gender, occupation, and the social organization of labor migration in Indonesia. As a faculty member, Dr. Chang was selected as a Rosenberg Institute scholar at the Institute for East Asian Studies at Suffolk University, and also as a recipient of the Southeast Asian Research Group Fellowship, which I believe also has a pre-fellowship component that graduate students can apply for as well. As a doctoral student at UC Berkeley, Dr. Chang received numerous fellowships and awards, including the Fulbright Hays Doctoral Dissertation Research Abroad Fellowship, the Henry Luce Fellowship, the Fulbright U.S. Student Program, we never know what to call that one, Fulbright U.S. Student Award Fellowship, they don't really specify, and the Critical Language Scholarship. Dr. Chang was also in the very enviable position of being able to decline a number of awards offered during graduate career. Dr. Hicks is here from the Department of History. Dr. Hicks is a scholar of 20th century Cuba. Her 2022 book, Hierarchies at Home, Domestic Service in Cuba from Abolition to Revolution, explores race, gender, and ethnicity by examining how Cubans perceived their maids and domestic work and how these perceptions affected domestic servants' lives and circumstances. While a graduate student at New York University, Dr. Hicks received the Ford Foundation's dissertation grant, which unfortunately no longer exists, but was a major dissertation grant at the time, and the Woodrow Wilson Institute's Dissertation Fellowship for Women's Studies, which I think is now under the auspices of the, they've changed the name slightly from Woodrow Wilson Institutes. It's the something for Citizens, Institute for Citizens and Scholars, maybe?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, okay. As a faculty member at FSU, Dr. Hicks has received the Florida Education Fund's McKnight Junior Faculty Fellowship and the Schomburg Fellowship from the Schomburg Center at the New York Public Library to support her research. We're also joined by Emily Liu, a PhD candidate in history. Emily focuses on military music in Japan, and she has somewhat recently returned from about 7 months of archival research in Japan, which was also funded through the Fulbright Hays DDRA Fellowship. Emily has also recently been awarded a Field Scholarship Award from the French School of Asian Studies, which will fund an additional 6 weeks of research in Taiwan. Congratulations, Emily. Before finding success with the Fulbright Hays, Emily was a semifinalist for the Fulbright U.S. Student Award and also applied to a handful of other major fellowships. So Emily has a lot of great advice on both how to find good fit funding to apply to, but also dealing with and learning from things that didn't necessarily go so well. So thank you all very much for joining us. I have questions that will guide today's conversation, but I also invite all of you who are in the audience to please also submit your questions, either raise your hand at times, put your questions in the chat. Please feel free to help us guide this conversation as well. So I asked the three of you to be here because you've all been successful in seeking and applying for and then receiving external funding. But you also, the three of you, have somewhat different vantage points on that, from associate professor to assistant professor to current PhD candidate. So I guess I'd like to start this discussion by asking each of you how funding has fit into your careers so far. For Drs. Hicks and Chang, how did graduate funding help you complete your dissertations? Do you think it was a factor when you were on the job market? Did the grant writing skills that you developed as graduate students, have they helped you in applying for things as faculty members? And Emily, what have the DDRA and the Field Scholarship meant for your work in the way that it's been able to develop, that it may not have been able to develop without additional funding? Dr. Chang, since I introduced you first, we can start with you.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to this conversation. And so in my case, and I think a lot of you, the other panelists have a similar experience, because I did international field work. And so the grant money was critical, right, to funding me through graduate school. And then so I graduated from Berkeley, and then so I did receive kind of a modest stipend, right? But that was not sufficient to do much more immersive kind of ethnographic fieldwork, right? And so the way I began was I first started by applying for internal grants, and then so and then different universities have different pockets of money, right? And so I apply for grants from my department, sociology department at Berkeley, and then later on, I also applied for fellowships and small grants from various research units at UC Berkeley. And so this was quite useful in helping me develop the skills for writing compelling research grants, right? And so the way I started off was doing more or less like a pilot study, right? So getting the grant to do, brief periods of research, let's say during the winter or during the summer, and then using that to get ethnographic findings, right? And then I could incorporate these findings into my grant proposals, right? And then so later on, and that became more both richer, right? And also, but at that point, I also became much more aware of what were the research questions that were of interest to me, right? And so at the very beginning, I mean, obviously the research, a lot of these research grants are looking for a really good fit, right, between your research questions, right, and then also the research design. So what are you proposing to do in order to answer your research questions? And it involves also like involving a detailed literature review as well, right? And so National Science Foundation workshop for the social sciences, they also came up with really good guidelines for how to write compelling research proposals. And so that's something that I encourage you to also look at if you're a social scientist. And so that has been useful. And I also looked at Friends research proposals as well, and to help to see like what kind of a templates that I can utilize, right? And then obviously it requires a lot of modification, right, for research projects. And then through that, it became easier and easier to get bigger grants, right? So first starting off from smaller grants, and then later on developing into bigger grants. Right. And then so some fellowships, they also are looking for, and I believe like Emily can also speak to this, um, institutional partnerships, right? So if you're going to an overseas um, location, right, sometimes you're required to provide evidence that you are affiliated with a local university, right? And so I would encourage, if you're doing international fieldwork, you want to establish these connections early on, right? And also to have sort of the requisite language training, right, in order to help carry out the research, right? And in some fellowships, they also require a personal statement. And then so the personal statement is essentially, in my case, it was about how my personal background informed my intellectual trajectory and then got me to where, I was as a graduate student and why I decided to study what I proposed to study. Right? And so I think these are basically some of the how I got fellowships over time, right? And then these also proved useful as I was applying for um, fellowships for faculty as well, right? And so once you've written your dissertations, so you get a much better sense of what kind of fellowships you want to apply for, right? For example, for book development fellowships and things like that. All right, thank you.
Yeah, and just one other question to add on to that is, do you feel like the fellowships you carried into the job market with you that you had on your CV by then, do you feel like those played a factor in your competitiveness? That you think they helped set you apart once you entered the job market?
I'm not sure. I think so. I think it was a combination of also awards as well. And so I think I don't know about other disciplines, but in sociology, for example, we're often trained to write papers, write articles, and then once you're on the job market, in my case, I would apply for paper awards as graduate students. Right. And so the American Sociological Association, for example, is divided into many sections, right? So depending on your subfields, right? So economic sociology, for example, and then and getting those awards apparently helped, right? And so when I was on the job market, that's one of the things that people commented on, getting these article awards, paper awards, and then at FSU, when I was in the interviewing for this position, that's also one of the things that they commented on. So awards, paper awards, and also fellowships.
Right. Okay. And it seems likely in your case that also the fellowships that funded your ability to travel to do the engaged type of research you did helped you write award-winning papers.
Yeah. Oh, and then just something to add. So my research was, and so really, if you're doing multi-sided, multi-country research, then grants are especially important. And I think like Emily, so my research sites were in 3 countries. So Indonesia, Singapore, and Taiwan. And then so having this initial experience in one of the countries helped me to later on expand into other sites as well, and then getting more. So for example, Berkeley, I got funding from the Institute for East Asian Studies, right? And so that is to go to Taiwan. And then I also got Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and that is for research in Indonesia, right? And I also got some small pockets of money from various sources in Southeast Asia, right? So Southeast Asia, for example, in Singapore, for example, they also have these small fellowships as well that you can apply for, right? And so it doesn't have to be exclusively domestic fellowships. You can also apply broadly in other countries as well, and to get fellowships from those countries without having to be a citizen of that country.
Yeah, that's a great point. Uh, Dr. Hicks, why don't you tell us about your journey with funding and how you have seen it fit into your career and where you are now?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I would say in graduate school, I think I'm coming from a position of pretty extreme privilege in that, frankly, NYU is a private university with a lot of money. So for the history PhD, for example, 5 years of funding were guaranteed, and additional years of funding were pretty easy to get if you needed them. But there was still a big emphasis on applying for and getting fellowships because of I think both because of the practice it offered in terms of talking about your research and honing a narrative about your research that other people could understand, and also the prestige that it granted. So I think, if I hadn't received the fellowships that I did, I probably would have successfully completed my PhD. It would have taken me a little bit longer. But I think that the fellowships I applied for and got were really helpful in terms of actually writing my dissertation. So a couple of the fellowships I got actually they were from the same place actually, which is the Cuban Heritage Collection. It's a kind of small research institute within the University of Miami that is obviously kind of dedicated to the study of Cuban history. So it's very specific. But I applied to a pre-dissertation fellowship there, I think the summer after my second year of graduate school. And I think that was the first grant application I did. And I think, to be fair, I think I got that fellowship because I think most of the people who applied for it got it because it's a fairly small number of people who want to work on Cuban history in those archives. But within NYU's kind of timeline of how the PhD worked, it was very much expected that you would be applying for fellowships. Like your big research year would be your fourth year of graduate school, which was after you defended your prospectus. So I was writing my dissertation prospectus at the same time that I was applying for the big research grants that I was applying for. And that was really helpful. Again, to be frank, I don't love the genre of grant writing. I find it very, very difficult to write about a project that you still need to do research for. So that was really hard. It's the genre of the prospectus and the genre of the grant proposal, right? So it wasn't the most fun semester for me, writing all of those grants and prospectuses, but it was really, really helpful in terms of framing my project, really just like thinking about my dissertation and ultimately my book and what those would look like. I think there was, and as far as kind of knowing what grants to apply for, I think there was kind of an informal document that was passed around graduate students at NYU that just listed a lot of dissertation research fellowships that people had gotten or had applied for and not gotten, et cetera. So I applied for a bunch of those pretty much based on that list. I will say, I don't want to talk too much about the Ford Fellowship because it unfortunately no longer exists, but my advisors encouraged me to apply for that fellowship, and I wasn't sure about doing that because it was really a writing fellowship. It was intended to be kind of your last year of graduate school when you had done the research and were finishing your dissertation. And I was applying for research fellowships. I had not done the bulk of my research. And so I was saying to my advisors, are you sure I'm eligible for this fellowship? It doesn't sound like I'm at the stage where they want me to be. And my advisors were all like, what, just apply. It doesn't matter. Apply. If they don't want to give it to you, they won't, but you should apply. And so I was like, okay. And I did, and I got it. So I say that to say, you should apply for the fellowships that are available to you. Of course, you shouldn't apply for something that's wildly outside of your purview as a researcher. But I think if you think it's a stretch, that's not necessarily a reason to not apply. And so I haven't asked my colleagues, why they decided to hire me. But I do have to assume that the fellowships I got in graduate school were part of it, in part because honestly, I've heard conversations. Obviously, we've hired people since I was hired, and there is not, I don't want to be unfair. There is a slight bias or a slight concern about hiring PhD candidates as opposed to people who already have their PhDs. The concern is, will this person actually complete their dissertation by the time that we intend for them to start working at FSU? That's a question that people have, and that's the position that I was in when I applied for this job. And so I think the fact that I had these fellowships, again, I have to assume made my colleagues more comfortable with the idea that yes, I probably would finish my dissertation in time, which I did, because I had gotten the fellowships that I had gotten.
It's a really good point about dissertation completion fellowships, right? Because they come with the requirement from the funder that you finish within their timeline. So they add a little additional security to those who might be considering hiring you, that you will finish within that timeline because you have outside pressure on it as well. Well, Emily, what about you? I know you can't look back on having been hired yet to say how these things have shaped it, but you can, I think, speak to the way that your dissertation has been able to develop that it may not have done without 7 months of research in Japan.
Yeah, so I'm probably like closer to all the participants here than the two faculty members are. Although, it's also equally important to hear from professional perspective. But contrary to Dr. Chang, I did not start small. The DDRA was my first real research funding. Before then, I had applied to a ton of, well, not a ton, a couple of fellowships. Some of them were very competitive, like big name fellowships, and hurt my ego when I didn't get them. But I think it was a crapshoot. The whole process was a crapshoot. I kind of submitted the same application. I don't know why, but the DDRA, kind of chose me. I was at first made an alternative candidate, and I was lucky because I think more funding um, flew in from the DOE. So then I was made an eventual recipient. Anyhow, so speaking to the importance of how that has helped me complete my dissertation research, because I study World War II Japanese military music, there isn't much I could do outside of Japan. Kind of the meat of the research, and not just archival work, but also, going to music venues, accessing music records, and kind of participating at like workshops. Those are only available in Japan. So, I mean, if I had stayed in North America, then maybe going to somewhere like Hawaii might have helped. But I mean, if I were going to Hawaii, I might as well just go to Japan. So, from a practical stance, um, this big, generously funded fellowship package that supported me living in Tokyo for 7 months was very crucial for me to complete a very well-rounded fieldwork research.
Yeah, absolutely. And while you say that you basically submitted the same application, that's true, but you also worked on applications over like a 6 month period and put a lot of work into them, and each one was a fairly different thing than the ones before, even though you were describing the same project. So things were refined more and more for each one. But still, yes, as you also raised the point of, sometimes you will never know why a very similar description of your project appeals to one funder but not to another. But I think that's a good point to segue there with that idea that applications are hard to write. And I think there's particularly two places where folks in the humanities and social sciences can struggle in ways that STEM applicants sometimes don't, because and those two areas are significance and methodology. Right? In STEM, there's a lot of ways to describe significance and methodology, describing your experimental approach. there's already sort of established guidelines and established experimental approaches, and you talk about the different techniques you're using or combining in different ways. The significance for many STEM projects is somewhat apparent in what they're doing. They're taking on big medical questions or big engineering challenges. But humanities can be a lot harder sometimes to explain both how to put your methodology into words other than basically saying I read some stuff and then wrote about it, or I interviewed some people and then wrote about it. And to answer that so what question, that is, I often think, it's the easiest question I get to ask when I'm working with students and the hardest one that they have to answer of why does this matter? So let's talk about those things because those are really the crux of a successful funding application. Let's start with the question of methodology, the one that's maybe a little bit easier to sink our teeth into than significance. So funding proposals, whether you have 2 pages to do it or 10 pages to do it, need to know what your methodology is. Reviewers need to see how you're doing the work that you do. How have each of you gone about explaining what your method looks like so that reviewers can actually understand how you're spending your time during a grant? We can go in the same order we've gone previously. So, yeah.
Right. So with research methods, so I can't remember the sort of the earliest version of my grants, and so it was really challenging, right? So like when you're first starting off, without knowing what to observe and then things like that, that could be really challenging. And then so I think it was like really in the later stages that what my methods were going to look like, my research design become clearer over time, right? As I spent more time in the field and things like that. And I think what I first got was, I believe it was the Fulbright Student Fellowship to do sort of a substantial period of research in Indonesia, right? And so before that, I had already spent some time in Indonesia, but I hadn't really done the ethnographic portion of it. And then so I can't exactly remember the formatting of the grant fellowship there, but I believe the student fellowship was not as detailed when it comes to the kind of research methods you're going to do. I think there was more emphasis on your personal statement, right? Institutional affiliation and things like that. So at the time, I had a completely different project in mind. And then, I still got the fellowship, and I ended up doing something completely different from what I proposed to do for the Fulbright Student Fellowship, and they didn't mind. So it didn't really mind, and so it was a complete difference. And then it was really the second phase of my field work. So I spent about a total of, I think, 22 months in Indonesia, right, in different phases. And then so my first phase was like exploratory research. And so I went to these field sites, and as an ethnographer, you're supposed to be embedded, right, in these communities. And then so I spent some time, I wrote up field notes. And then at the end of that first phase of my research, I had a much clearer idea of why my methods are ideal for answering my research questions. And I had a much stronger idea of what my dissertation project was going to be, right? And so I think my trajectory was a little bit unusual. It's sort of like more exploratory. So you start off from exploration, and then later on, because as ethnographers, sometimes it's really challenging to gain access to your field sites, right? And so you don't really know beforehand what you're going to find out in the field, right? And then so that preliminary time that you spent in that community or in that country can be really, really useful. And then later on became much more compelling, I think, because I imagine the selection committees can see that I spent some time in the field. And then some of these field notes ended up being incorporated into my research proposals. So I can include a vignette, for example, based on what I've observed, and then use that to craft a more compelling research proposal.
So that's super interesting because I feel like something that happens fairly often, right? When you're at the graduate level, when you're at the doctoral research level, you don't know what you're going to go find when you start whatever the research is, whether you're heading to an archive or heading out to the field. You're kind of waiting to see what is actually going to be there, and you don't exactly know yet. But it's not compelling to say in a funding proposal, I don't know what I'm going to find. So How did you sell it, or did you describe that first stage in proposals as exploratory, or did you have a more structured way of explaining a structured sort of exploratory approach that made it a bit more methodological in the description?
So if I remember correctly, I think so a lot of the early phases of my proposals were more about literature reviews. And then so like I did very extensive, reviews of the literature. And then what are some of the questions that sociologists and other scholars have found important? And then I think much of what I identify early on was primarily more of an empirical gap, right? And I think it's much more compelling if it's both an empirical gap that you're filling and also a theoretical gap. So there's a theoretical tradition in your field, um, and then you're trying to deepen that conversation, right? Not only are you identifying an empirical gap, right? So there's not a lot of studies done on this particular population. But you're also saying that, well, this case is very critical or strategic for answering this question. And then furthermore, I think sometimes they also like to see, funders also like to see that it's substantively important, right? That this is a phenomenon that affects perhaps many people in the world today, right? Or it is a major social problem, right? And then sometimes like citing just the statistics a little bit can help to contextualize that, right? And then later on, as I mentioned, the vignettes could be really useful, especially if you're doing ethnographic field work, because then you prove to the selection committee that you've already done the first leg of your ethnographic project and you're already training yourself to become an ethnographer. So it's no longer just an abstract discussion of methods, but in fact, you actually have the experience doing that, right? And you can actually mention that in your methods. It's like, I have already spent, I think my first phase was 6 months, right? So I had already spent 6 months in these Indonesian communities. I have gained access to these sites and things like that, and then use that to further um, deepen your discussion of your methods, right? And then so I think in my case, the trajectory was a little bit unusual. So it doesn't sound like, like in graduate school, I think when I was a graduate student, I think in my first seminar, for example, I think one of the things that a lot of the faculty advised graduate students is like, this has to be almost like airtight, right? That you have a research puzzle, and then you have these like clear research questions, and then there's a tight connection between your methods, questions, um, evidence, and then what are your deliverables? And so this will culminate in a dissertation project and things like that. But I think, to be honest, I struggled with that format at the beginning. And I think it was through a lot of this iterative process of gaining more data and then also digging deeper into the literature, then I was able to identify more clearly what the theoretical gaps are,
Yeah.
right, in my
Absolutely.
case. And so that was that fieldwork experience was very important for helping me to figure that out.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Dr. Hicks, what about you? I know, I mean, as a historian, I'm guessing you were describing different archives you were going to, but again, how did you describe your method as doing more than reading and then writing about it?
Yeah, I think your description is especially true for historians. That is pretty much what we do, is go to various archives and look at the documents there and then write about them. Which I didn't try very hard, I suppose, to make that seem like I was doing something other than that. And looking back at my grant applications from graduate school, I noticed that I was very specific about where I planned to, go look at documents and write about them. So I wrote, I'm going to spend 4 months in Havana and I'm going to go to the National Library and also to the National Archives. And here are the collections I've identified at those places that I think will help me. Then I'll go to the city of Camagüey, which is in Eastern Cuba, and I'll go here and here. And so I was because I had been to Cuba previously, I was able to be really specific about where I would go and what I would look at, which I think was attractive to funders because it made clear the plausibility of my project. The fact that I wasn't just saying, I'm going to go to Cuba and see what's there. was like, I've been here before. I have an idea of what I want to look at, and here's my plan for making that happen within that time frame. I will say, I think the one kind of, I suppose, somewhat unique methodology I employed in my dissertation was the use of oral histories. So I did emphasize my plan to use oral histories, which is not of course, not all historians could do oral histories because not everyone researches the 20th or the 21st century. But that was one specific methodology that stood out about my project, which I did emphasize.
That's great. Well, and I think Emily, I mean, you make great points, because that is something that, Emily, I know you and I spoke about when you were first starting the Fulbright application of there being not a whole lot of distinction necessarily in that application between your timeline and your methodology discussion, right? You're giving them a sense of what you would actually be doing on the ground, the places you'd be going, the sources you would be looking at, basically also amounts to a description of the methodology you would be employing to do the research, right? So what was your experience of sort of having to think all that through before you were able to go to these places?
Just to test, can you all hear me okay? Because I had to switch my headphones. Okay, great.
The sound's a little different, but we can still hear you just fine.
Okay. Well, as part of my, I guess, fieldwork methodology, I had to kind of explain how I am a historian. I come from a historical training, but I also have musicological training, so it's interdisciplinary. And at the same time, I was visiting archives, or I planned to visit archives. So that was very much like part of my application, and really the foundational part of my research is still based in archives. But I was going to be visiting musical events, musical gatherings, and engaging with people while they're making music or participating in musical activities. Kind of, like in the past applications, I gave examples on, exactly where I plan to do to access the material besides the events, and specifically what items I plan to look at or what people I wanted to engage with. Aside from that, I think a huge part of it, like Casey was saying, like addressing the contingency. What did you didn't find what you had set out, what you had planned to find, and what if you end up learning, something that's or it's just incomplete or not helpful for research. So in my case, I tried to kind of survey a very wide range of available archives and libraries, with even like very distantly relevant records. So addressing that contingency is very important. And I also wanted to say, like, some fellowships, the ones that are, I think, with very specific goals, they're okay if you are a historian, that you just go into, literally read the material and then synthesize it in your writing. So it really depends on the mission, the goal of the fellowship.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good point. And not just the goal of the fellowship, but also the sort of expected review audience you can count on. If you're speaking to a bunch of people who are also in your field and are more familiar with the conversations in your field and what method looks like in your field, then you can probably get away with both briefer descriptions, but also maybe a little bit more of the sort of insider talk that we're trained to do in our disciplines. Whereas if you're speaking to a review audience that is a mix of people across different humanities disciplines, or even more broadly than that, you have to know how to be able to describe things in a way that will make sense to them and still seem to them like the work you're doing is legitimate and serious research. And that brings us to the next one I wanted to consider, which is how to explain significance. And so here I want to talk not necessarily so much about the field contribution that you're making, but the sort of broader impact or broader significance of your work that more diverse reading audiences will care about, that publishers will care about, that colleagues of yours outside of your own field will care about. And one of the major fellowships that students are these days applying for that really distills the importance of this down is the Mellon ACLS Dissertation Innovation Fellowship. So you all might have been familiar with the Mellon ACLS Dissertation Completion Fellowship, which used to exist. It was a dissertation completion fellowship. They got rid of it in 2022. In fact, on the day that we were supposed to do an info session on that fellowship, we got an email about 3 hours before the info session saying, hold up, we don't have this anymore. And they've replaced it now with this Dissertation Innovation Fellowship, which intervenes funding at the third year, basically your first year of PhD research, rather than at the dissertation completion stage. And it is available to students in the humanities and interpretive social sciences. But you have a whole application there where you are writing a 7-page project proposal, a 2-page personal statement, a 2-page bibliography. You can append appendices to it if you would like to as well. And then inside the application itself, you're asked to, within something like 1,000 characters, explain the relevance of your project for the humanities as a whole, which is basically a very short place where you have to give them the big pitch of the so what, right? And it doesn't matter if you're working on something that's, you know, a 2,000-year-old ancient text, a classical text, or a, you know, 20th century U.S. history that most of your readers might be familiar with, right? It doesn't matter. You still have to pitch to them the very broad significance of what you're doing. You all are working in different areas and in different eras, but you're all working on scholarship that takes you outside of the US, and then you're writing back to US funders to say, this work matters and you need to fund it. How have you gone about thinking through what that significance is and how to make that pitch? How do you try to communicate that in very plain language and in ways that help us get back to, hopefully, not just the particular questions of your field, but those bigger questions that unite us across humanities disciplines or even just across, you know, questions of the human endeavor? We'll stick with the same order. So Dr. Chang, if you kick us off.
Right. And so in my case, I think like knowing to sort of these like really big questions, right? So how are you contributing to the discipline? So a lot of this experience, I think it was not directly related to grant writing per se, although grant writing was very useful, but it's a very unique genre of writing, right? And so for me, it was really about writing more and more papers that I got a stronger sense of what the contributions are. And so sociology is unique in terms of we're a more theoretical field, right? And then so there's a lot of emphasis on what are the theoretical contributions of your case study, right? And then so one way that we do, especially if you're trained in a particular qualitative scholarship, is to think of how do you place different bodies of literature in conversation, right? So how do you extend a body of literature by basically synthesizing different bodies of literature, right, to answer a question that isn't well addressed by either bodies of the literature, right? And so it often involves that, right? So for example, in my case, there is a lot of the labor literature, right? And so labor scholars have, for example, examined labor processes, but a lot of them don't really talk about migration, right? And in my case, I study labor migration, right? And so I'm bringing the migration literature in conversation with the labor literature, right? And so that's one of the ways to stake out your interventions. And so that could be usually is a pretty effective way in sociology, right? And so this body of literature has this gap. Doesn't talk about migration. This body of literature talks about migration, but doesn't talk about labor. And so how do we bring these two in conversation? And so these are my contributions, right? So bring them in conversation. So that's one of the ways to do it. And but that can be challenging because that requires you to be very familiar with these existing bodies of literature. And then moreover, you want to be able to use your empirical evidence. And so for me, what is the most important is that it has to be really well grounded in your empirical evidence, right? So what exactly are you passionate? What kinds of questions are driving your research, essentially? And then how do you set yourself apart from the existing bodies of literature? Because not everyone's going to study exactly what you studied, right? And then when you're doing your research, what were some of the questions that you were the most passionate about and you felt that the existing scholars are not paying sufficient attention to? And so use that as a starting point to guide your interventions, right? Right. And so that's how I went about doing that.
Yeah, I'm thrilled that you said that at the end, because I often think that one of the things that when you get deep into the research, especially on a dissertation, and you're working on it every day, sometimes it's easy to lose sight of what it was that initially intrigued you about the area you're working in. What are those things you found really interesting when you started looking at the sources or reading the literature? What were those questions that made you think, oh, that's weird, I want to look more into that, and sort of get back to the thing that you found sort of initially exciting and motivating to do the research? And if you can have that come across to others as well, then they can get excited about your research too. But if you're sort of so deep into doing the work and slogging away at it that you have forgotten what those driving questions were sometimes, it can be a little harder to feel that spark of excitement and to have it come across in the proposal. Dr. Hicks, what about you? How have you thought about explaining significance, especially with a project like yours that's going back to spanning the 20th century and going back into the 19th century, and making a claim that that's history that's still relevant for people and something they should care about and invest their time and money in?
Yeah. So after we finished our comprehensive exams at NYU, we had a kind of like mandatory workshop for 5 days where different professors were in charge of it for different summers. It was at the beginning of the summer where we just learned basically about what was expected of us from then on within the PhD program. And something all of the professors said, or one said, and they all agreed to it. They were like, it was really hard for me to articulate the significance of my project basically until I finished the book manuscript. And we were all like, well, that's really not helpful at all, is it? You're telling us to write all these grant applications right now. So I don't really see why you would say something like that. But unfortunately or fortunately, I think to an extent they were correct, because I've had a similar experience where now I feel like I can fairly easily distill the significance of my book into a sentence, but it's 3 years after my book came out, right? So I guess I say that to say I think it requires a lot of time and patience with yourself. As you just said, it can be difficult to kind of step out of doing the research, being in the archives or being in classes. If you're so deep in the research, it's hard to step away and say, why would a person I ran into on a street care about this? How do I get it across to them? It's very hard to do that when you're really, really deep in it. But I think it starts with what Dr. Chang said about kind of finding gaps within your field that exist already. So my project about domestic workers in Cuba, the gap I identified really is that they weren't discussed. They are not discussed at all in the historiography of Cuba, even though Cuba has a really rich labor historiography and a really rich history of labor agitation, and also a really rich historiography of the history of race, and activism grounded in racial difference. It has all these historiographies that, to my mind, intersected with domestic workers, because most Black women who worked in Cuba worked as domestic workers, but there was really nothing about domestic workers. So that was the gap in the literature. But something my professor said that was helpful, when they were talking about grant applications, they warned us against saying in a grant application, no one has ever written about this before. Because they were like, maybe no one's ever written about it before because it doesn't matter. So it's not good enough to point out that no one's ever talked about it before. You can say that if you want, but then you have to say why someone should have talked about it before. But I think once you can identify the gap in the literature, it's easier from there to go to the kinds of questions that you were asking about why it matters as a whole. Like, I think really my book is about the maintenance of a racial hierarchy in a country that claims to have been a racial democracy. I think domestic service upheld that hierarchy in kind of a quiet way throughout the 20th century. And I think questions of racial hierarchies versus racial democracies and how work affects how we think about race and gender are very immediately relatable to America in the 21st century, right? But it took me a long time to be able to articulate that. But I was encouraged very early on in graduate school to start trying, to start, even as you're writing your dissertation, even as you're thinking about how you're going to write your dissertation, to keep asking yourself, why does this matter? Why does this matter?
Yeah, that's great. And as getting distance on the project does often make those things more clear, but of course you're not in the position to do that when you're working on the project, or even still imagining it and applying for the funding that will make the project possible. So Emily, I think that's a little bit closer to where you were when you were trying to do these things. And I know that I asked you a lot to work on the so what question for your Fulbright application. So where did that lead to you? I mean, what have you learned in the process?
Well, I learned that first and foremost, the truth that I learned is that not everyone will see the value in what I do, but it doesn't mean that it has no value just because maybe somebody else doesn't immediately see it. Because the trick is to get people to care, to agree with you that this thing that you're doing has value. And I think everyone and every fellowship has an entrance or entry point. So, we discussed before how the mission of the fellowship matters, and how to tailor your application and the expression of your research to meet their goals and their agenda. I mean, for instance, the Fulbright program cares a lot about intercultural exchange, creating mutual understanding. So you have to find a way to communicate how, your project specifically can help facilitate that. And, for me, I study World War II military music. How can military music from wartime be a conduit for intercultural exchange? Um, I think what I wrote in my application was that the significance was twofold. First, World War II it's still a point of contention in East Asia. They have disagreements on the legacy of the war. And I think I said something like understanding the point of contention invites us to evaluate the issue as a seminal step toward eventually building mutual understanding and perhaps peacemaking. And obviously, military and propaganda music, it's not unique to Japan. I study the case in Japan, but I also kind of contextualize it in a globalized and transnational narrative. And Japanese military music is, I mean, there's no scholarship on this in Anglophone literature. So for me, it wasn't necessary to address like, that aspect because it's so obvious, but it was necessary to argue why, because like Dr. Hicks was saying, why it doesn't exist, but it's worthy to study.
Great, thank you. We can open it up. I mean, those of you who are in attendance, do you have any questions? I have a question I can use as a sort of concluding thought, but I would love to offer anybody a chance to ask questions of our panelists that they may have. You can either just unmute yourself, raise a hand, or just put a question in the chat.
Hi,
Hello.
my name is Zainab. I'm a graduate student at the Department of Religion here at FSU. My question will be deduced from what one of the speakers said earlier about sometimes some of the projects may not be valuable to some people, but it doesn't mean that it's not valuable. So now my question is, how can one link up one's research interest to a particular grant? I don't know if you understand my question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. I think I do, and I'll phrase it maybe slightly differently, which is also just to ask you all how you found these things as being good fits for the work that you're doing. How do you know that a particular fellowship or grant opportunity is well suited to the type of project that you are doing or that you are proposing to that opportunity? Emily, we'll start with you on this one. Yeah, because
Yeah, my answer is very short because like I just needed a fellowship that was that paid me enough to be abroad and do my research for, maybe half a year or so. Because like for example, if you study American history, you can afford to maybe travel intermittently throughout the year, but I can't do that obviously. I can't just fly to Japan, be there for 2 weeks, and then fly back here and then do that again. I mean, there's so many logistics and health reasons that you should just kind of consider, right? But anyhow, so the Fulbright program, it funds you to do that. That's their goal. And also, it was one of the very few opportunities that I actually was able to find for this kind of like international research trips. So yeah, so for me, it was very evident that I really needed this help.
Yeah, so my experience was similar to Emily's. And so to identify these fellowships, I mean, if you're doing international fieldwork, there isn't that, I don't think there is that much, that many grant sort of fellowships that are available to support international research. And I think for domestic research, it's a little bit easier, right? And then so for international research, I think I started off identifying these potential pools of money like as early as my first year in graduate school, right? And then so that was also when I started doing language training, and then applying for the Foreign Language and Area Studies Fellowship. I don't know whether that still exists these days, but FLOSS was a really useful way to do language training. And then later on, you kind of like, you talk to other people and then you look at other people's CVs and then you figure out, well, this scholar who does research that is kind of similar to mine, this is where they got their fellowships and things like that. And that kind of helps you to do it, identify these potential pools of money. And for example, if you're an anthropologist or you do ethnographic research, the Winter Grand Foundation is one of the key places to do that. And I figured that out from looking at other people's CVs and things like that. And then so it kind of like, it depends on that, right? So what kind of research methods do you use? Is your research domestic, international? Do you feel that, and looking at the websites of these funders, do you feel that your research is kind of connected to their mission? And then you're going to tailor your language to the language that's being used in that research program, for example, right? So Fulbright, I think, was really about, right, intercultural understanding. And then so you kind of use that language in your research proposals, right? And so I think that was really how that happened. And let me think. Yeah, so essentially that's sort of the process that I sort of use to identify these sources.
Yeah, that's great. And you started speaking to Lauren sent me a question that they have, although it came just to me, so I'll read it out loud because I think it's one that you all are already speaking to, and Dr. Hicks, your answer can incorporate it as well. And Dr. Chang, you just addressed it a bit, which is how do you determine the language or tone that aligns best with a particular grant? More specifically, what different methods does one use to tailor a proposal depending on where and what the grant is for? And I would absolutely say one of the key places to start with that is to study that funding that funding opportunity as fully as you can. read through all of its mission and vision statements, look at what it has funded previously, study the language that they are using to emphasize the areas of research that they are interested in, and then do what you can to make sure that your proposal is sort of echoing back some of that language to them. But Dr. Hicks, I know, for instance, you applied for the Woodrow Wilson Institute's Women's Study Fellowship, so that's more narrowly focused on a particular area of scholarship than something like Fulbright is, which doesn't really care what area of research you're working in, as long as you're doing an eligible project and speaking in that sort of language to being open to cultural exchange and promoting mutual understanding. But the whole range of topics is available there. So you obviously sought one because you saw it as a really good fit for the particular type of research you were doing. So what is your experience with tailoring to particular funding agencies?
Yeah, I would say I cast, in terms of looking for fellowships to apply to, I cast a really wide net, and then narrowed it down from there. So like you said, the Ford Foundation is less interested in the kind of work you're doing than in its, the plausibility of the project and the idea that you could get it done, that it's a compelling project in general. For the Woodrow Wilson Institute, now the Institute for Citizens and Scholars Fellowship, it was or is a fellowship for women's studies particularly. And so my logic was, my project is about women primarily, so I'm going to apply for that, which I would have done for kind of any specific aspect of my project that I felt was related to any kind of fellowship. So something I was going to say to the first question is thinking about your project from a lot of different angles, like what field are you in? What fellowships are available for that specific field, but also what geographic region do you research? If you research a specific geographic region, does that specific region or country have fellowships that are available to you? Or does, a US funder fund research in that region? Something that's kind of funny, I think there's, a logistical aspect to these fellowships too. I didn't apply to the Fulbright, which both Dr. Chang and Emily got, because they don't fund projects in Cuba. For obvious geopolitical reasons. So it was a very, very easy decision to not apply because they would not have considered my project. But yeah, I would say also, I think this is kind of reverse engineering what Dr. Chang said as far as tailoring your fellowship, your application to the fellowship itself. Finding people who received that fellowship. Sometimes funders have like recent recipients, right? Trying to find those people. You might find that you know them since, academia can be a small world. So you could ask them personally, like, hey, can I see your application materials? Or if you don't know them, if you know of them, you can still reach out and ask, what their thoughts are on applying to that fellowship.
Absolutely. And that's also something that I can do if we have recent recipients at FSU and you're interested in applying for the same thing that they have previously won, we can try to facilitate a peer connection between you and another FSU applicant for that award. Sheila, you have your hand up.
Yes. Thank you all for sharing your experiences. I just had some nuts and bolts kinds of questions about how you structure your proposals in terms of like what information do you front load, like as far as what you start out with, and what information do you sort of deprioritize, like maybe you relegate it to your fourth or even your fifth paragraph. I kind of start with like sort of an abstract of my project, and then maybe get into like some of the fit of my project with the goals of the organization, or what my progress has been so far, what are my qualifications, and then just adding on to that question, a little sub question is how much creative leverage do you give yourself, creative license, as far as like maybe starting with an anecdote, or you just really matter of fact throughout it all?
Great question. I will say my general advice is to follow whatever prompts you are given and to stick to the order of information provided in the same order that they're asking for it in. So DDRA, for instance, provides it has a very structured review process. And they tell you in the Federal Register exactly what things they are looking for in the 10-page narrative that they're asking for. And the very common and successful approach with DDRA is to write it in the same order that they're asking for it. So I'll start there as sort of general advice for almost anything. If they give you a complicated prompt that says we're looking for X, Y, and Z, you structure your thing as X, Y, and Z, although how you open, is always up to you. But how have the three of you, do you have a standard way you approach these things? Have you found anecdotes to be useful? Dr. Chang, you mentioned using vignettes once you had them. So maybe we'll start with you and see how you've done that.
Right, and then so this was actually kind of a suggestion provided by a friend, and so she was a sort of a trained as an ethnographer, and then so she and I think as Dr. Hisk mentioned, right, you can ask your friends for tips on how to write these proposals, right, and these grant proposals. And so in her case, she used vignettes, right? And then so we're basically trained in a very similar kind of style of ethnography, like that involves comparison, right? And so comparing these two sites. And then so the way I framed it was similar to her, is that there are these two sites, and these two sites they're very similar in many different respects, but there's variation. And then this variation is quite striking, right? And so I use that as a hook, right? So I use a very short description, because oftentimes in these grant proposals, you can't write out such a long, extended ethnographic description. So it has to be very short, maybe a couple sentences long, right? And so for one site, this is what it looks like, right? And in this other site, this is what it looks like. What explains this variation? And then you follow up with this puzzle, this empirical puzzle, and then sort of connect it to the existing literature. Can the existing literature adequately explain this puzzle? And then what is your proposed solution for that puzzle, right? And then so that's the way that I kind of framed it, right? And then so that's one style, and I think other styles are kind of involve some kind of substantive significance. So in the opening paragraph, you immediately state why this is such an important phenomenon, right? So either this is like happens to millions of people across the world, something that's very important, that sounds very substantively important. And then, however, there is not enough attention paid to this particular aspect to explain the social phenomenon. And then this is why my project is filling that gap, right, and contributing to this literature. And so I think that's, two common strategies to do that. And I think a lot of faculty advisors told me that starting out with a puzzle is a very effective way to do it, right? And so that puzzle can be empirical, or it can be theoretical, or it could just be substantively a very important phenomenon, and yet scholars haven't paid enough attention to that.
Yeah, it's great, because either of those approaches get right to that what we were talking about earlier of get the readers to be intrigued by the same thing you're intrigued by. So if you can set up the look at this phenomenon that we don't understand. Isn't that interesting? And then they think, that is interesting. Tell me more. Yeah, that's often a very effective opening. Dr. Hicks, how have you approached structuring proposals, especially given the challenge that even at their longest, they are still pretty short?
Well, first, I want to echo what you said. When you're working with an application where there are very, very clear parameters about what needs to be in the proposal, it's better to be maybe seemingly kind of boring but compliant with your application than to be really creative and interesting but possibly miss something that you should have included. I think most funders are going to go with the boring but compliant one every time, because they want to know what they want to know. But other than that, a lot of, especially in the humanities, a lot of grant applications don't have those super, super specific structures in place. So this is extreme influence from my advisor, because in contrast to what Dr. Chang said, and it might have to do with our different fields, my advisor was passionately against anecdotes. She, we would look at sample grant applications, and every single time she'd be like, nope, I don't like this, if it began with an anecdote that kind of led into the broader significance. So I think almost all of my grant applications were kind of like my dissertation proposes a history of domestic service in Cuba. That was the first sentence. And then I went into the significance. But that is incredibly subjective, right? Because I think anecdotes are really interesting and compelling. I can also see the value in just starting right away with what you're going to say, and including an anecdote later. And I think both impulses come from the same place of wanting to engage your reader right away, either engaging them by just telling them straight up, this is what you're about to read about, or getting them interested in a puzzle, as you said.
Yeah, I think that's good. I will admit, personally, I do enjoy reading a good anecdote, but it often works much better for like a chapter opening. You just don't have enough space in a funding proposal to, spend a whole opening paragraph on an anecdote that then leads you to halfway down the first page saying what your project is actually about. I think it's most effective to start very strongly at the beginning of saying, here's what my project's about. Emily, what about you? You've worked on a number of different things in the last year. They've all had different formats from, 2 pages for the Fulbright US student program to 10 pages for the DDRA. So have you found anything to be sort of standard across those, or have you found that you just sort of have adopted a standard approach to them?
Both. I think I for my for the Fulbright US student essay, not for the personal statement, but for the research statement, I think I started with lyrics,
Mhm.
excuse me, a Japanese military song lyrics. I think maybe like 2 or 3 lines, very short, since you only have two full single space pages. Um, and for my DDRA application, they were more strict with the organization of your whole. It's a 10-page research proposal, and they kind of delineated, like section 1 is the introduction. You have to tell us, like, basically, like, cut to the chase what you're doing here. And so, I mean, based off of, many of the fellowship applications I've come across, it seems like that hook is definitely, it's unanimous. Everybody can agree on. You need to let the reviewers know what you're doing, first and foremost. And I mean, I personally put in the lyrics in there because I think without the lyrics, it's hard for me to kind of introduce my research, kind
Mhm.
of cut to the chase, because that's what I study. A lot of my research is also lyrical analysis. So it was a great way to, it was kind of like an instrument to help me, explain that. But yeah, so for most of my fellowship applications, if it's allowed, then I would put in, my equivalent of an anecdote in there. But I tried to keep it short because,
Mhm.
the reviewers read so many applications, that they just want to quickly review, yours and not to, waste their time.
Right. And I mean, you call it an anecdote, Emily, but having read your application, I know that that takes up like 2 lines at the beginning. It's not like a whole paragraph spent on laying out an entire song and then talking about the analysis of the lyrics. It's a pretty short sort of, hey, look at this interesting quote. It brings up these questions. Here's my project. Um, but with that, you mentioned something that I think is really important to keep in mind, which is to sort of remember the psychology of the reviewers. That reviewers are often they've agreed to review something. By the time they actually get the stack of things they're reviewing, they may regret that they agreed to review for it. They may be very busy with other things in their lives. They may be reviewing your application at 10 p.m. when they'd really rather be heading to bed. And so you don't want to stick to a very clear and structured order in a funding proposal so that you make it easy for your reader to find the information they're expecting to find in that application, whether that's through subheadings, bolding some sentences here and there, following the prompt as it's given. If you're not given a prompt, then using more of those signposts that you can insert yourself to give the reader a pathway through, knowing what sections they can skim to find out your methodology, your contribution, the literature review. And it's also going to matter whether you have 2 pages or 10 pages. So there isn't necessarily, as we've seen here, sort of one standard answer to how to approach writing. And a lot of it does have to do with the individual opportunity that you are writing toward. But I would say from everything said here, a strong opening that explains what your research is, what your project is, and then just focusing on clarity throughout the rest of the proposal is, two key takeaways, I would say. Do we have any other questions from the audience? I scheduled this from 2 to 3. I know that we are about 20 minutes past 3 at this point. I don't know whether any of you panelists need to go. If you do, I certainly understand. But if we have time for additional questions, I'm happy to take them.
I kind of have to run.
Okay, well, that is perfectly fine. I certainly understand. I guess if we have a second for it, I'll ask just one final question. For those of you, I mean, all of you have now applied for funding you've been successful with, but you probably also applied for some things you weren't successful with. Either way, I'm wondering what you know now that you wish you'd known before you started applying for grants. What did you have to learn the hard way that maybe we can save somebody in the audience from having to learn in a similarly hard way? Another way to ask that same question would be, do you have any parting words of advice?
I think my advice is certainly easier said than done, but like I said, even though in our time at NYU was not dependent on getting grants, there was still a lot of pressure among graduate students to get grants, and people who got really impressive grants, like the SSRC or the Fulbright, everyone knew and was very excited about it, which is great. But it kind of added this pressure when everyone was applying, like, if I don't get these grants, then I'm not worthy. Maybe I shouldn't be here. Maybe my project is actually stupid, and that's why I didn't get any funding. Pretty much what Emily said in the chat. The result of your fellowship does not reflect your worth. It's important to apply for fellowships. You should apply for as many as you're kind of capable of, but you shouldn't take it personally if you don't get one, because there are so many reasons why you might not get a fellowship, and almost many of them have nothing to do with the quality of your work or the viability of your project. They're logistical, they're things that you couldn't possibly know because you're not in the room with the people reading the applications. Maybe they have too many people working on what you're working on, even though your project is good. So just not taking rejection personally, basically, is my advice.
That's great advice.
Yeah, and I
Yeah,
guess
I'll just, oh,
go ahead.
Emily, you go ahead since you said you had to run.
um, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was just gonna quickly chime in that yeah, like personally, I think the biggest challenge that I went through was a mental health challenge because I invested so much in my first Fulbright application. I had so many people rooting for me as well. And so when yes, I got a semifinalist, but in the end, I wasn't awarded the finalist, and I was confused and very distraught, and I didn't really know what to do. And I remember that the advice I received was maybe you can try to reach out to the 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 reviewers. And at the time I knew that, having passed the US screening meant that the US reviewers were happy with my application, but there's something went wrong with like the Japan commission, the Fulbright Commission. And so I actually looked up every single person on that commission, and I found a couple of people who are in academia, because not everybody on that commission is from academia, which to my surprise. But I reached out to a couple of them, never heard replies, and I kind of realized that, sometimes these things just fall through, and you don't get closure from it, basically. But that's where I do have to say, for like the DDRA, they had a very clear criteria and point system. So they actually reported back your feedback, and they explain why you got the points that you did. So that was I think a lot more helpful than actually just having your project rejected without any explanation whatsoever. But take care of your mental health.
Yes. I mean, getting your a rejection without any explanation is the norm. Those that provide feedback these days are fewer and far between. So most of the time you don't know why you weren't selected. And absolutely the number one thing to remember is that that is not a reflection on you or your work. It's just funding is competitive, and you could have had a great project, but you could have been one person below, and you'll never know if you were one person below getting it or 200 people below getting it. And it doesn't really matter, right? I mean, it just, you could apply for the same thing the next year with the same exact proposal and get it that year, just because it has to do with the readers, and maybe one of your reviewers was feeling particularly tired and annoyed one night when they read yours, and they scored you 3 points lower than they would have if they had read it the next morning after napping, right? So we never really know these things. But Dr. Cheng, what is your parting advice for students?
So, I mean, given that this is a competitive process, right? And so, of course, you don't want to personalize it if you get a rejection. But there's also one way that you can figure out whether this fellowship is overly competitive or not, right? And so obviously the bigger the grants are, the more competitive they are. But there are certain fellowships where, for example, the Fulbright, it's also dependent on the country that you're doing research in, right? And so some countries are more competitive than others. So everyone wants to go to that country. And then so you can look at the data and then you can see, well, actually, this is very competitive, and maybe I want to choose another destination if you have the language skills to do it, right? And so in my case, Indonesia worked really well because there is just not enough sufficient number of sociologists who have done field work there. And then so I think that was very useful. And then I'm not sure about other fellowships, like maybe you can take a look at them and to see if what are the records of like how competitive it is. And then so like NSF, for example, is very competitive. And then so that one is very hard to get it. And so if you don't get it, it is not a reflection of your merits, right? But then if you look at other fellowships, some are less competitive, right? And then so you can kind of have this fallback option, right? And so if I don't get the NSF, then I can get the second best. Like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as if Emily were still here, she would be able to vouch for this idea. But basically, I mean, again, Emily applied for like 4 things before she got the DDRA, describing the same project, having very strong applications for each one. She got semifinalists for the Fulbright U.S. Student Award, and she kept applying. And that's what you have to do, is just keep applying till you find the thing that will work for you, and know that from each of those, if you don't get it. There's a quote by the excuse me, Florida singer-songwriter Gamble Rogers, who says, "Experience is what you get when you didn't get what you wanted." And that's very true in application writing, right? That even if you didn't win the award, you had the experience of writing an application, explaining your work, starting to home in on how you're explaining the significance and methodology of what you're doing. And the next application you work on, those things are going to be slightly more refined. And so that next application is going to be, just by nature of being the second one you're doing, it's going to be slightly stronger. The third one's going to be even stronger than that. So each time you do it, you're producing a slightly better application, but also you're just trying another opportunity. Maybe it's going to be a little less competitive one year or the other. Maybe you're going to have reviewers that just like your project more than reviewers for the other project did. And it's really hard to know at the outset what those, which one of those is going to be the one that works for you. Any of the ones that Emily applied for could have been that one. It just happened that it was DDRA. So yes, absolutely, always, keep your head up and keep applying. That is also something I'm happy to do. If those of you who are here and maybe considering applying for something, I can help you sort of strategize against those different applications. Think about, if you're considering a number of awards, which ones might be worth prioritizing and really putting your time toward, which ones might be longer shots, and which ones you seem like you're a better fit for. So we'll wrap things up here. Dr. Hicks, Dr. Cheng, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you sharing your time with us. For those of you who did join us today, I welcome you to, reach out to me individually if you are planning to apply for anything. You can find my email. Well, I already sent you a reminder email, so just respond to me there if you want to. We can always meet individually. And I hope I see you at other OGFA workshops in the future.